Hello and welcome everybody. My name is Jona Moro, and on behalf of Depot I want to welcome you to today's book presentation. We're very happy that you're here. I'm really excited and interested in what you have to say. Thank you also for joining via live stream. And on regards of that, I want to have a little remark for you guys. For the discussion afterwards. If you don't want to be heard on the live stream, then just don't take the microphone I'm gonna offer you. So just stop me there. Then only the people in the room will hear you, but not the people on the live stream. Yeah, thank you very much for coming, everyone, and I wish us all an interesting evening.
Hi. Is this working? Hi, everybody. Good evening. We, Frida Robles and I, Kathrin Heinrich, are very, very happy to welcome you today to the book presentation of the anthology Addressing Amnesia, Performing Trauma. This book is a result of the symposium of the same title in May last year at the Angewandte, and also a research project of the same title. After a short introduction of the project, we are very excited to discuss some of the themes of the book with three of its contributors. Eva Kernbauer, who is Professor of Art History at the Angewandte and who was instrumental in the inception of the project. Sonja Riegler, philosopher and researcher at the University of Vienna's Philosophy Department, and performance artist and sonic choreographer Franz Zehetbauer. A warm welcome and heartfelt thank you to all three of you and all our guests, you. And of course, we also welcome all contributors and listeners online in the live stream. We would also like to thank you. We would also like to thank the Zentrum Fokus Forschung at Angewandte for funding this project in the framework of the INTRA program, and the Department of Art History for hosting and supporting us. We would also like to thank the publisher Günter Friesinger of Edition Monochrome for the very straightforward collaboration. And a very, very special thank you goes out to our graphic designer Ania Ceska, whose fantastic work really makes this publication what it is. Not just a collection of texts, but a book that we hope our readers will enjoy reading and looking at for a long time. Can the scars of historical trauma be traced, felt, or embodied through art? And if so, how are artists and scholars currently dealing with these concerns in Austria? These were the central questions that fueled our interest as we conceived of the project Addressing Amnesia, Performing Trauma. Following the so-called historical turn, art and art history have in recent years been shaped by discourses around history and an accompanying surge of performance-based and performative practices. This anthology, thus, probes how these two strands intersect within the arts and the humanities by exploring how contemporary art practices performatively deal with repressed history in Austria. Since we believe that the issues at stake here cannot be grasped by or reduced to art historical research alone, it was our aim to bring together a host of different, diverse contributions that allow for a more interdisciplinary perspective. These different contributions, whether they be essays, artworks, or traditional papers, investigate how a historical trauma is performed, how it is reflected upon, how it is studied and written about, and how it is perpetuated or disrupted, and what role artists or scholars might play in these processes. And now over to you, Frida, to dive into the book's contents.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. And I have to apologize because I'm a bit out of depth with a ear infection, so I'm a bit dizzy, and my voice can come across a bit dizzy as well. But maybe it's somehow interesting in connection to trauma. I will just read briefly some of what the contributors do in this publication, like just to have a brief of everyone's contribution, and we're happy that some of you are here. So we are grateful for everyone that contributed to this publication and the wide range of topics that were addressed by each of the artists and writers. It is important to note that there are many topics and problematics that are not addressed in this publication, but given the nature of the project and the vast and complex histories of Austria, we are happy to add in the continuation towards strengthening historical awareness from the performance arts perspective. In many cases, historical traumas have been denied or never been acknowledged, while at other times a more insidious perpetuation has taken place through the installation of monuments or the unwillingness to change or deinstall existing ones. There is an urgency of dealing with historical symbols in public space, which Eva Kernbauer analyzes in the opening essay, Performing History, Excavating Time. On the other hand, there are efforts to install rightful monuments, like the Gastarbeiterdenkmal in Vienna to honor immigrant workers, a topic. Okay. A topic Sonja Riegler addresses in her essay, A Space Yet to be Filled, by whom? Ignorance as an institutional and interpersonal practice. This anthology examines not only performance art, but also practices that otherwise engage performatively with archives, monuments, and historical sites and narratives. One of the most prominent quotes by Austrian author Robert Musil, that monuments are invisible, is the subject to Tanja Schulz's letter to Musil that reflects on the current state of memorial culture in Austria, employing means on the case study of Alfred. Whoa, this is a, I cannot pronounce this name. Memorial Against War and Fascism. 3 artistic contributions illustrate different approaches towards monuments in public space, like Israel Martinez, who entitled No Illusion as a comment to the Mexico Platz commemoration of how Mexico was the first country to oppose the annexation of Austria to the Third Reich. But Israel Martinez criticizes further as maybe also how Mexico has been having a diplomatic face, but having a violent face towards their own citizens. In her essay, Sitting Next to the Alex Franz Zehetbauer performances series, Fountain Trolls, is the artist performed with waters in Vienna's public space. Thomas Geiger takes a more scientific, didactic approach in his bust talks. Slipping into the role of a translator, he interviews busts in public space, like that of Hans Klöffer in Graz, stressing the poet's problematic status as both beloved writer and fervent national socialist. The role of Austria and Austrian citizens as perpetrators is not only mirrored in materialized history, like monuments, but also in how historic sites are being dealt with and how memorial culture is shaped. In her essay, Sitting Next to the Past, Martina Gimplinger analyzes Clara Furey's performance, Even When They, in relation to Heimrat Becker's practice of Nachtschreiben, and argues how the performance constitutes a memorial practice akin to Walter Benjamin's concept of Angedenken. Drawing on the notion of post-memory, this anthology aims to address traumatic legacies of past experiences that cannot be represented as information or contained in archives or documents, but are understood as durational performances. In her essay, Telling History of Displacement Through Objects, Katarzyna Nowak analyzes everyday objects that aren't part of official historiography, but tell the trauma of displaced persons in Austria and Germany through the objects. In her films, The Letters and Flashback, Belinda Kasim-Kaminski explores the unwritten dimensions of Austrian archives and the former monarchy's imperial history that haunts them. With Café Cairo, Oscar Cueto funneled his artistic research on Orientalism in Austria into a space of community and civil resistance in the public space. In conversation with me, Claudia Bosse explains the historical trauma of the restructuring of the Danube food plain that informed her performance Oracle and Sacrifice in the Woods. And Nisrin Buhari outlines the concept of wanderism as a state of mind, the trauma of flight turned into artistic practice. And now, we are very happy to introduce to you Professor Eva Kernbauer, Sonja Riegler, and Alex Franz Zehetbauer. And each of them will give a brief presentation on their contribution, and we're very happy to have you here. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so thank you everybody for coming, and also thank you both, Frida and Kathrin, for this opportunity to present this book here, and also obviously also for editing this book and doing all the work for us with our contributions. I don't have anything written out here because obviously this has once been, or this was once an essay that I gave over to you, so I have this printed out here in 2 small script, unfortunately, and I have a few notes, but they're in German. So just, this is the few layers of temporality and historicity here as well that I will just try to cobble together now to give you an idea of what my essay is on. You have the title, you had the title here. It's my essay is called Performing History, Excavating Time. Alexandra Piric and Nicolas Galanin, Deconstructing the Temporal Politics of Monuments. And so this is obviously what I'm mainly interested in. The temporal politics, the historicity, the temporality of monuments in the sense of Denkmäler, Mahnmäler. And I'm, very specifically actually thinking about statues here in a very, in a sense of how really also monuments are easily found, in the city of Vienna, and obviously because both artists that I'm writing on are actually working with statues, in this very simple sense. So the temporal politics of monuments, if you just think of an easy and obvious example, the way that the Riegler monument has been debated in Vienna, or was debated in the last years, or actually decades, I'm repeatedly struck at how often still, even by people who are very history savvy and know a lot about history, even historians, how easily monuments are still identified with the past, or let's say with history, and because history is identified with the past, it's very easy to relegate them basically out of reach into a sphere of, actually non-time, not history actually. And while obviously every monument, everything that has been erected at some point in the past, but specifically statues that honor specific persons, their historicity is much more complex. You have obviously a specific date of erection of the statue. You have a historical personage that maybe at the time even wasn't alive anymore. Maybe a historical personage as well. You have a specific political stance that is being expressed by erecting the statue. That very often also conveys a specific understanding of historicity. In the case of statues, obviously, it's very often a hero and single person-oriented concept of history. But then also you have the now time, the present, which is very much part of history. If you actually think of conceptions or more critical, more politically nuanced conceptions of history that actually understand history as connecting past, present, and the future. So, obviously it doesn't just end somewhere 100 years ago. So this is basically the whole problem that I've been trying to unfold in a very brief theoretical introduction. Actually, this is a very brief essay, and most of the room is given to the 2 artists that I think address this specific problem very well and very succinctly, and also publicly visible. Because I really believe that contemporary art is extremely well suited actually to deal with these, to make these historicities visible, and both projects I think are really very successful in doing this. So What I've tried to describe as a problem, I mean, basically this also touches upon this very well-known observation by Musil that nothing is as invisible as a monument, but I think actually what I believe is described here very specifically is the way that monuments and especially statues actually claim a kind of how do you say that? Überzeitlichkeit in German, basically a non-historicity of being there, having been there forever, and basically claiming to continue to be there, basically claiming eternity for themselves. So this is not a kind of invisibility that I think is actually just, makes them powerless, but quite the reverse actually. Many monuments actually claim a lot of power by becoming so invisible in the sense of just, being naturalized somehow. Just they've always been there and they will always be there. They're kind of untouchable. They're not part of our present. And, as I said, this present moment is really important to my conception of history. And so both artists very much reclaim the monuments they work with to the present. So the one sentence that I could have read to you, but as I said, it's really just too small, contains this observation that monuments very often mask their own performativity, basically, as the historical performativity. And this is exactly what these two artists address. And of course, now we have this term performance or performativity, addressing amnesia, performing trauma, that is really important to both artworks that I'm writing about, but also is important to, I think, concepts of history. And also, obviously, it's an important term in terms of political theory, and I'm very briefly mentioning this, mentioning Elżbieta Martinia's performative democracy, which, goes back to Hannah Arendt's concept of politics also as a stage, a public stage. So this performative aspect is important, not just in politics and in art, but also, as I think, in history. And so when I say that successful statues master their own performativity, this is exactly what I mean in the term of that they basically, they master the fact that if they're still around somehow, I mean, the fact that they are still around as part of the present, not just that something invisible, but also that they master the fact that keeping or deciding to keep a statue on is also always a kind of decision in the present, And obviously, this is problematic if we're deciding to distance ourselves politically from the people depicted. So, to get to the two examples, because I think I don't have much time left right now. But okay, so I will be brief because really both artworks do exactly what I've tried to describe as necessary so far. The first, as I said, is actually a series of public performances by Romanian choreographer and dancer Alexandra Piric, who very recently, I think, was appointed professor in Munich, so for performance, which is great. So she will be very close. And her monument, the image that you see here is from a performance called If You Don't Want Us, We Want You. And it's from 2011 or 13. I can't really read this here either. Something like that. And it's a statue. Well, this is a public monument, in Bucharest. And to be very brief here, what she does is basically have a group of performers gather around the statue and imitating the pose of the monument. I mean, it's really very playful, actually, and very low-key, something that you can easily, recognize and also basically just perceive you just walking by, something that immediately also translates into an image. And maybe just to make the point here, the youngest performer here is actually the statue, because at the time it was 4 years old. So maybe this is a good example of how quite a different kind of temporality is claimed by one protagonist here. And of course, Piric has continued doing this series of performances also in this vein, she's also created very different choreographies and performances, but she has also created this series because it's a really powerful gesture in other cities and at other festivals and art events in the last few years. Always, really reclaiming these statues as performers actually in the present. Yeah, to be very brief. Okay. And the other example, much farther away, obviously. The other artwork that you see here by Ida Pinkston is I'm just mentioning it very briefly. So Nicholas Galanin's performative or installative piece is the second one I'm discussing a bit longer, but as I said, the essay is really brief. This is called A Shadow on the Land, an excavation bush burial of 2020, and it's a kind of a public installative piece in Sydney's Hyde Park, and it's on a Captain Cook statue. Basically, it's a very simple gesture of excavating the exact area that the shadow of the statue would create on this park. And there are quite a number, obviously, of metaphors here with the shadow and history, and the bush burial is an indigenous practice that Galanin does not share. He's also from an indigenous community, but from Alaska. Basically integrating this as a way of dealing with history also integrates an indigenous practice that is very often relegated to an allochronic past, something also untouchable, not part of history, to the present. So there's this whole very interesting notion, I think, of excavating used here. But also on a formal level, I think it's a very powerful piece, as you can see, because really, the whole monument, the whole statue as such, as with the pedestal and the figure is basically toppled, visually, and also very much part of, our height, our immediate present. So, to just conclude, in order to also give room to our other speakers, I think that both artworks are good examples of how contemporary art practices can really, reclaim historicity, and especially in the case of those objects, namely monuments, that claim so much to represent history, but actually, I think, really negate their own historicity and basically always try to escape, a more critical engagement with the past. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, and we have some questions prepared, but we would like to facilitate a conversation with all of you and all of you at the very end. So we would just hand over to Sonja, and
okay.
Then works.
Great. Thank you so much for the invitation, Kathrin and Frida. It's a launch and presentation, so this is super exciting to me. I'm still a baby academic. And so my contribution to this really great volume is on ignorance, because this is also the topic of my PhD thesis. So I work at the Department of Philosophy here at the University of Vienna. And in my PhD thesis, I tried to come up with a new account to ignorance. And when I read this contribution again a few weeks ago that I wrote, I actually realized my contribution here is much more about research ethics, actually, because so I have a specific case study to highlight what I want to do with my account of ignorance, because I see ignorance not merely as an absence of knowledge or belief, but as a political practice that serves certain interests of certain groups. And so this is why I apply this account, or I try to inform my account through a case study, namely institutionalized ignorance on the system of guest work in Austria. And then I began to wonder, when I started this case study, how can I, as a researcher, as a scholar, speak about the struggles of a group, in this case migrant workers, when I'm not part of that group? So how can I speak about this whole social entity without speaking for that entity, so to say. And first of all, just to give you a bit of background, what informs my account of ignorance. So first of all, I think it's super important for me to understand that ignorance is situated. So what we know, what we don't know is, of course, largely influenced by how we are socially located in the world. So think of Donna Haraway's thesis of situated knowledge, for instance. This is also something that we can apply to non-knowledge or ignorance. But it's really also very important to understand that ignorance sometimes is strategic. It serves strategic, oppressive goals in our society that are, of course, also tied to certain forms of privileged social identities. So, and here a concept that really is super important for my research comes from a philosopher, Charles Mills, who coins the term white ignorance. And so white ignorance denotes the fact that sometimes white people or privileged people have a positive interest in interpreting and seeing the world wrongly, because it sustains their privilege, it sustains their powerful situatedness in society, basically. And what I realized is that this concept is often deployed to highlight forms of racial ignorance, but it's always so much dominated by the US experience. And this is why I thought it's really important to also bring this to Austria in a way. And I think that the case study of guest work in Austria is really illuminating in that sense, because I, for instance, never learned about the system of guest work in school. So it's not part of any official curriculum that is taught in high schools in Austria. It is also, to my knowledge, not part of any longer term exhibitions in museums. And there's rarely any public sites of remembrance, such as monuments, though this is now changing a bit, and we can address this later. And of course, also it is repeatedly denied from official representatives, from politicians, just like 2 months ago from Karl Nehammer, that Austria actively benefited from that system to bring foreign labor to the country. And I think this is, such a telling instance of a form of institutionalized ignorance and collective amnesia, in fact. And when I started, so in my thesis, or for my thesis, I do interviews, which is very rare for a philosopher. And sadly, I'm no social scientist and no historian, so I really use these interviews to inform my theorizing. And I did interviews with migrant workers, former labor migrants that came to Austria by means of the labor recruitment agreements. And when I started to do that, I began to feel a bit of a discomfort, because I was wondering, well, whose stories am I telling here? With what rights do I tell, or do I use these perspectives, and then am I somehow extracting pain narratives or experiences for my own academic benefit? So this is a huge worry that I had. And I still don't have like good answers and solutions to these questions, but I think I have some tentative guidelines that really helped me to guide this process of doing interviews. And so one concept I want to highlight today comes from a philosopher, Olufemi Taiwo. Check him out, he's great. And the concept that he uses often is, he calls this being in the room privilege. For instance, the fact that I'm now sitting here today is a direct product of my privilege of being in an institution, having the money, the resources, the time, being funded to write a thesis, actually. And I think that this being in the room privilege also points to a certain political and also like epistemic knowledge production related responsibility to not leave this task of unraveling forms of social injustice to set groups. Secondly, what's also really guiding concept in that regard is the concept of epistemic exploitation. Actually, I wrote a text with my colleague Flora about that. So epistemic exploitation means that marginalized subjects are often expected to again and again perform explanatory labor about their specific form of discrimination or social oppression that they experience. And in fact, this really leads to unfair expectations towards these groups. It also leads to the fact that these groups, when they then give testimonies of their experiences, are not believed, often because of social prejudices. So I think this is a further guiding motivation for my research, to not allocate this intellectual and explanatory labor only to marginalized groups. Another thought that was super important for me in this process is to really own up to my own ignorance. So when I started doing my interviews, I knew so little about the system of guest work in Austria, about migrant labor, about it being the backbone of the economy back then and also now, if we look at the care work sector or harvest work. And I think there's a really fine line between asking someone with compassion and exploiting someone for their explanatory labor, but it's possible, I think, to ask people, like, ask them with solidarity and with compassion without, expecting them to do all the work. And lastly, what I also found super important is to realize when it's not my turn to speak, when it's my turn to redistribute attention, to be silent. And this is also why in my thesis I highlight a concept of expertise that is not very often mentioned in social science literature, namely that I see my interviewees also as experts, and they have a certain form of experience-based expertise that does not come from systematic training or from higher education, but from being immersed in certain communities and making certain experiences. I think I'll leave it here, but this was basically what, accompanied my process of interviewing.
Thank you so much. Alex, do you want to give a brief introduction or start with the video?
Yeah, I can. Oh wait, is this? I just really wanted to use the mic because it's so furry. I'm not an academic. I'm a performance artist, and what I prepared are some videos of a project that I do called Brunnentroll. It's like a concert performance in public fountains, and yeah, and it comes up in the book. And thank you. Oh, I forgot to thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me for this. Okay, I will move over there and take this with me. Thanks. Okay, so I thought just because it's fun to see many fountains, I'm going to show two videos first that are very really short videos. They're kind of more, they have little bits. So the first video is basically all of the fountains in Vienna. And the second video is 3 fountains in Graz, where this has taken place. And then I'll show maybe one more video that is sort of a little bit longer and from one single performance. Is this going to make sound also? Yeah. Okay. Fingers crossed. Can it be louder? That's the first one. It's very short. Maybe something to mention that I didn't mention before that's kind of nice to know is that in this performance, all the sound that happens is live. It's all done with an underwater microphone, and there's someone on the outside who operates a looping pedal. So there are some moments that are looped, but there's no effects or anything. It's really just the underwater microphone and the voice in combination with the sounds of the streams, of the fountain. Yeah. Okay. I don't know which one is fun. I mean, they're all fun. That's why I did it, because it was fun. Okay, but maybe we just go with this one, because it's beautiful. Yeah, this is Brunnen am Eisene Tor in Graz. And this performance was part of the La Strada Festival, which is like a festival for art and public space that happens every summer there. And this is also, again, it's not the whole performance, it's only 3 minutes, so it is sort of, yeah, edited together. The way the performance works is it sort of has I would say like a carrier bag dramaturgy. It's not like a start to finish kind of thing. It's more I have a bag. I come with a bag of choreographic practices with water, vocal practices with water, different sort of modalities of working with the streams, whether they're coming from above or below, or ways of interacting with the audience, and a song. There's also a song that tends to appear in each one. And then, however, these things spill out of this bag in the performance is sort of left to the moment. So it's a very leaky structure that is never the same, and a bit uncontrollable, also because the microphones themselves are a bit uncontrollable. Thank you.
Okay, thanks to all three of you. So, how should we start this? Are there any pressing questions from the audience, maybe, for one of our contributors?
Not, I can.
Just do you want to start?
I can start. You can start as you prefer.
Okay, so maybe I have we have a few questions for each of you, but as I was reviewing the contributions that we saw or learned of today and the other contributions in the book, I realized that while we were initially interested in how trauma can be thought of as a long durational performance, as Diana Taylor, who was our keynote speaker last year, conceptualized it, that the thing that most, if not all, of the contributions have in common is that while they use performance or performativity in a way, they are always also addressing a material object or a monument or public space in some way, or an archive with the film of Belinda, for example. So the question that really, for me, is still sort of unanswered and that I'm posing now to all of you is, can trauma or historic trauma ever really be performed or dealt with performatively without in some way addressing the written history or the materialized history? Because I feel that, you address the Gastarbeiterdenkmal, you have the fountains and the monuments, it's very obvious. Is there a way to move beyond the material history?
Maybe to add, but it will be also complex, so let's see. What I find very important that you, Eva, in your text, you mentioned Hannah Arendt's concept of the public space as a space of appearance. And I find that very interesting to think of history also as a public space and as a space of appearance. And maybe in that way, how are monuments being objects of appearances and objects of ideology and of ignorance or not, and that are being performed in space, and what are these objects or these narratives performing, which histories are they performing, and that we're sharing on a daily basis without being conscious of it all the time. So I think I would be interested on, it's interesting to think of it interdisciplinary, especially the fact that, for example, Alex, you deal also with water as one of the elements that is there and that we're many times not acknowledging, which is one contribution of Nisreen Buhari, who's also dealing with air and the breathing air that is part of the common and on the we and on the publicness of it all. So I don't know if maybe this can trigger some conversation on what is the public and how are you guys thinking about it. But it's maybe too broad of a question.
What is the public?
Yeah, or yeah.
I mean, I have an association with that question, I guess, because so one topic that is really important now in the debates that I'm working in is the idea of epistemic reparations. So after atrocities that also have an epistemic consequence, such as erasure of history of marginalized peoples, for instance, or erasure of knowledge, epistemicides, how can we make amends in such a situation, not only on a material level in terms of reparations, economic reparations, but also on a knowledge level. And actually your contribution that highlighted the performativity of monuments really made me think of that in a way that if we think of a monument as also being an object where, of course, ignorance is portrayed when we think about, I don't know, monuments of former slaveholders and all these bad guys and people, could we also think of monuments as restoring justice, an epistemic justice, and justice in a performative way, that it's not only a statue that is there invisible, but that we, I don't know, co-create through some kind of interaction with it. This was like my association with that question.
I mean, I think it's funny, or when I think just the public and water, just something that I think about. I was reading this fact the other day about how when we, just through breathing, we disperse out into the world like half a liter of water, at least every day. And so we also take in half of a liter of water every day. So if we think about that and like the nature of our like wateriness and the wateriness of the world around us, we kind of all share a public that is constantly cycling through all of us. And that's just kind of a nice thing to think about. Yeah, I mean, yeah. I think this felt really present also with the pandemic, because that, like, you know, this sort of covering up of this leakiness, you know, was so present. Like, no, I can't be leaky. People can't get me, you know? We can't share that in that same way. And that's been, I mean, that's something I think about often in the public space with the waters there, and also how, like, these public spaces, they create such, like, it's so, something I learned about performing in public space that was really beautiful was the, that it felt so generous, the way like community gets instantly built, like when the children come in the fountain and start to play with me. And I don't, yeah, how you can't have this unexpected audience, how much it gives, because a lot of times people in there's this like general public that one doesn't reach when you perform at a you know, like a Brut or in Tanzquartier. You know, it's like a different kind of audience that comes to that than the one who's just walking on the street and it's like, oh, what's that happening? And then sits there. And so this is also like the privilege. Yeah, that's nice. Yeah. I don't know if that, I'm not sure that really answered it. Just I just thought I would.
Yeah, but
I could talk.
It's a super interesting point that I was sort of maybe trying to get at, like the difference. Because you perform at, say, Brut, also with water, the difference to the like historic location or the temporal speciality of the fountains versus the sort of art space, and how, like, is it possible to relate to history in the same way as like the fountain immediately does, for example?
Yeah, with the fountain, it's already there. History, like you have to, it's whether you deal with it or not, it's there. Yeah, it's like it is the backdrop, I guess. Yeah. I thought something that really stuck with me from what you were saying was this thing of the choice of the everyday, that we forget that the monument is a choice, an everyday choice, and I think that there's something very like important about that. Yeah.
But what I find also very important is to question this idea of the monumental history and like to persist on criticizing them. Like history is everywhere, right? It's not only on the historical monuments, and it's not only represented there, and it's not only oppressive there, because it's very easy sometimes, or we can fall on that trap of like just addressing the monuments and the big sculptures and and that's where the violence is happening. When it is one of the violence for sure, but it's not the only one by any means. Which I find important and I find it very interesting dealing again with performance art in public space. And I go back to one of a quote from your text, Eva, when you say that artworks appear as social actions that lay the ground for meaning to be created performatively. And I think for me that is the interesting part of art. Like how can it affect a space? And in that sense the question here is how is art contributing or acknowledging or commenting on historiographies that are not being so much discussed in Austria, which there are many.
I also think this is a really interesting point that you made, because if this equation that I mentioned at the start of monuments with history and history with the past, the side effect is what you described, that everything else is somehow lesser or not. And but as you said, you know, it's everywhere, and we're also part of the past and of history. I mean, we carry this with us, right? Although, I mean, this equation with the past is not as interesting because it's really just very banal and very, very, very misleading also. So of history, obviously that would be more important. I mean, what you can also see, I really liked, obviously, beautiful Brunnentroll performances. I mean, they're really also fun to watch, and I wish I had seen that in Graz at some point, because really this is a great context maybe for that, because it's so easily accessible, right? But I mean, but what is so striking here is that all these fountains are part of public space, and of course they are much more positive than what we were talking about before, and also what is described in my text. Because I mean, the most pleasurable parts probably of historical monuments, maybe, or of ways to create a public site, but still they are not used a lot. And this is the same thing that happens with statues, because they basically occupy a public site and also public space and the public sphere to some extent, and they make it totally inaccessible, you know. And you know, this is the same thing basically, you know, turned around. What to do with, you know, with time, you know, making it inaccessible. And so I think just, you know, walking up there or into it, you know, is already a really powerful gesture. Again, you know, to reclaim them for our present, and both in a spatial and in a temporal sense. So it's, that is a really liberating thing to watch, I think, also apart from the fact that it's also beautiful to see you playing with the water and the sound that comes from it. Yeah.
But I was actually wondering about that. Did you need permission to enter the fountains at any place?
Yeah, we in Vienna. I'm not sure how it worked in Graz, because there we were invited by the festival and they took care of all these permissions. But in Vienna, when we did it the first time, it wasn't within. We got funding for the project from Kör, from Kunst und öffentlichen Raum. So we had to. It was sort of self-organized. It wasn't by a house or something. It was just with this funding, and there we had to apply to every single district. But some of them were still in, like, I was kind of surprised that we got it. One of the fountains in Vienna was in this very fancy neighborhood, in like Cottage, I think it's called Cottage. Yeah, it's like a circular. It was in the middle of a roundabout, so like there were cars that were like all drive. It was like in the middle of the car thing, and it was so funny because cars would like slow down and continue to go around and around. But that's the one where the police were in, yeah. But they were nice. They were just checking in to make sure everything was good. Yeah. But what I liked is that sometimes it encouraged people to come in with me. And I thought if I do this, if I were to think of another fountain concept, I would be curious about a way to sort of take advantage of this sort of, this like privilege to trespass. That like that it's like it's a bit that I kind of in this current structure I keep this privilege to trespass for myself, like I don't, you know, and that if I were to do another fountain concept, I would love to figure out a way in which I somehow reach out a hand and kind of create more of a punk atmosphere of like I have this privilege to trespass, but I can also just take you all in with me, you know. If you so like something like bring your bathing suit, and I think that's when we start to really change, like really address these sort of I don't know, the sort of maybe bourgeois like stiffness of some of these fountain spaces, yeah. Especially like
I mean, we would be interested to learn about like the specificity of the sites you chose, or how you go about choosing them. For example, because you used the Siebenbrunnen fountain, which is like a sort of charged site of Austrian history. Could you speak to that?
Yeah, the main factor that decided the fountains that we did in Vienna was that they had to be in the fountains had to be in outer districts, because Kör didn't want us to have any very central fountains, because part of their, when they give you funding, they want, part of their initiative is to bring art to the outer districts. So that's how they put it. So we weren't allowed to do any fountains in the first or the second, or they had to be sort of farther away. So this kind of was the main thing. And the Siebenbrunnen fountain, I was one of the ones that we were allowed to do that was close, and I wanted to have at least one that was in a little bit more central, and this just happened to be a fountain that they would let me do it in that was a little bit more central. And it was only after that I kind of learned about this history and then thought, oh, that's also kind of nice, yeah. But in this moment, I don't really. It had something to do with it was like a lot of. It was, it was not my focus. So yeah.
But I think it's interesting anyhow, even if it's not the focus, that you play with it.
Yeah.
Like, because the site is already charged. But I mean, this fountain was supposedly built in the 20th century to celebrate the Habsburg, structures of
the waterways,
water
yeah.
in Vienna, and especially to the palace. So, I mean, that is quite crazy also how water is being distributed, funnel, channel, which is also part of a very structured and way how we're systematizing the world, no? I mean, and it's also, I don't know, for me it's also a representation on many other ways of channeling histories, stories, but maybe it would be great if any of you have any question.
Or comments.
Or comments, yeah, please. And
thank you. Yeah, very interesting and some curious aspects to the book and presentation. I'm really interested in looking at it. Actually, Sonja, your presentation sort of made my ears prick up, because it's kind of along the lines of things that I'm thinking about at the moment that are like almost obsessing me. And so I have a comment, maybe it's a question, I don't know how it's going to come out, but I'm just really wondering about the performativity of white privilege. What is that dialogue? And what is the expected response of the marginalized person so that that is a dialogue? What does it sound like, that unspoken script? Regardless of what you're doing or what you're saying, there's an expectation that fits and flows within those structures. If there is one, or if you're thinking about it or wondering what it is, I'm wondering.
That's such a great common question. And I think the aspect of performativity that you highlight, that is super interesting, because I mean, when I give this presentation, I don't want to come across as such a good socially engaged academic, of course, you know what I mean? But I think it's such a pressing question of our times. And we talk so much about allyship and active bystandership. And also we, like in our department, for instance, we address these things a lot. But we never, also generally in philosophical discussions about these issues, I always had this discomfort to look beyond it. And what I often saw was like people positioning themselves in text, for instance, you know, like I position myself as a white woman writing about this and that. But I always had the worry or the discomfort that merely positioning oneself isn't enough. And I don't know, I really don't expect, of course, like any, you know, applause, of course, or any, you know, sort of appreciation for what I'm doing. The best thing I could hope for is to have people I write about and I write with, still when reading it after the interviews, for instance, feeling seen and represented in a way. But I by no means make the claim that I am the person who's needed for that. You know what I mean? But, yeah.
Yeah, sure, yeah. Of course, I'm not expecting you to be the pinnacle person to change the world and that. But you did say that what you're writing about or just saying that, I can't remember the exact words that you said, but I think that what you're doing is a lot. I don't think that's not an incomplete thing. I think it's a giant leap. I think it's a giant step. If you're writing about, if you, what do you say, align yourself with the marginalized, then do you see yourself, can you, or can anyone who has white privilege actually see themselves resigning it? Can you have a dialogue, or can you see yourself performing, I say performing, but I think it's a performance, isn't it? Because it's about an expectation about what's there, isn't it? So, I don't know. I mean, it's just some thoughts that I have.
I mean, resigning white privilege is a really great, like, discussing point, I guess. I have to confess that when I started this case study, I often worried, like, why should I do this? But I also thought it was not being done in that way, and like theories were not aligned in the way that I saw necessary at that moment. And sometimes I think it's also about, I might not be like the best person to do this, but I'm the person who's doing it now, you know?
Yeah. And I'm not trying to lay everything on you for this like huge responsibility, but it's just that I was like talking like, oh, I'm sorry if I'm going on too much, but to a friend from London who I grew up, you know, all the way back then, and he's moved to America, and he was saying that, I was like, well, why did you go to America? And he wrote back, well, you know, there's more opportunities for black people, you know, like it's much more, people are more open to black culture and things like that. And I wrote back, I said, well, you know, I really have been sort of like colorblind, like in the past, but now I'm sort of like, oh, well, take those glasses off, it's not really working. And then I said to him, why is it that black people have to perform blackness in order to be part of the capitalistic structure, just so, you know, you can pay your bills? Why isn't it the other way around, that there's just the deconstruction of this structure of white privilege or white power? Mm-hmm. Then it wouldn't have to be that everyone goes fighting racism. So anyway, but I think what you're doing is great. It's a really interesting research, and I like your approach. And yeah, so
yeah. To talk more afterwards if you're around.
Yeah. Okay.
Any other questions from the audience?
Thank you. I would be interested in how you see the relationship between sculptures, like in the more formal sculptures, and then maybe forms of, doing an everyday art, like let's say, which would be, for instance, on graveyards. Maybe one could see that sometimes, or on just another example, like in Austria, in the countryside, there is sometimes stitching. I don't know if I say it correctly, but like very everyday arts, form of expression that transport some feelings that could contain some notions of trauma. And how do you see the relationship between this everyday expression of maybe trauma and related feelings and the formal sculptures? Because obviously there's a different sort of discourse behind. So I don't know how you see that. Would be interesting.
Like folk art.
What was the countryside? Memorial practices, right?
Knitted things. Knitted.
Yeah, I mean, like more ordinary things that one could find. Like one person just decided to stitch, like a sort of saying on like a picture, or
but in
someone had a more individualized
at home, basically
tombstone or whatever. That's just examples that came to my mind. Any relatively normal item of any like private or even more public space, but that is does not carry the emblem of a monument.
Answer?
Is it okay if I speak? Maybe I can answer for this, because during art and related, like to trauma, there's two opposite acts. There is remembering and forgetting. So what you're trying to ask, like when we do monuments, is for remembering, but for the kind of art that you refer to.
It's also remembering.
It's actually forgetting. It's in the process of healing, because you do this continuously as like craft, as drawing, especially like the ones that takes a very long time in the process. Two are very important, because if we don't do monuments, we don't remember what happened, and this is very important. But also if we don't do this kind of art, that we won't be able to heal our wounds. This is from my experience.
Maybe, I mean, what you described, obviously, are practices that are very private, and even a graveyard, even if it's public accessible, what happens there is also considered intimate and more private, right? But, I mean, I can see how this, especially, you know, as the title of this evening is addressing amnesia, but also performing trauma. I mean, always also deals with trauma. It is important to also mention what you said now, you know, this, the important aspect also of forgetting. But maybe I wouldn't make this separation as clear, because I think also, if we remember what Sonja said, every public monument is also an act of forgetting. You know, you framed it as ignorance, or you know, aphasia is similar. You know, it's also a decision of how to frame history. You know, what to remember, but also there's a lot that is actively then obviously not remembered, not forgotten in a healing sense, obviously. But then we are at trauma, right? Newly produced trauma, basically. But yeah, so maybe I wouldn't really make this differentiation, or maybe just, I think it's necessary to make a second one on another level also.
I mean, you both, Sonja and Eva, mentioned the ignorance as practice in your text and the monument as practice, and it's also like I don't want to be like a teacher, but we have one contributor here, Martina, who has a text in the book that very much refers to practices, performative practices of remembrance and memorial culture. Maybe you would like to say something to that question?
Yeah, what was going on in my mind was like maybe the potential of performative practices in relation to so-called objects of history, of archives, of museums, whatever. Because recently I was kind of like with the performance that I'm writing about in the book from Clara Foray, what like through her living body, let's say, like through her senses, and she's doing a very meditative practice that is really a lot about lying and breathing, as we can see there, and slow movement. And for me it was very interesting to see this relation she has to the object, the so-called object that is lying on the floor. Like, my question is like, how can this living body of Clara Foray animate maybe a non-living body, or reactivate, or bring it into presence? And like this object from the past, for me it was really like she brings it into the present through her breathing, living body. But also it's interesting because I think also the way she addresses the object, she doesn't address it as a dead, static object that is passive, but she kind of listens to this object. Like, for me it was very interesting to see, as she believes that this object can speak in a way and change her movements and influence the way she moves. So it's also interesting that, you know, the object does something to her and she does something to the object. So there is a relation that is maybe more than just object-subject, which is really interesting. Or also with your performances with the water, I felt like the water is doing something to you, it is changing your movement, but you are also doing something to the water. Like there's something going on there that is maybe more than just, yeah, I don't know, a subject in the present meeting an object in the past that is not alive anymore. Like there is liveness on both sides, kind of. So
I was just thinking, would you say that this performance maybe kind of brings together these two dimensions of collective trauma and collective remembering? Because I mean, this is an object that is a found object of a concentration camp site here in Austria, and the kind of personal mourning practice that one does, you know, by oneself at the graveyard. Would you say like the performance brings these two together in a way?
I don't know. I find it difficult to answer because because the object also is part, like there was so much transformation with the object that I think it also changed, like between more collective related memory and more individualistic maybe. So I cannot really situate it so clear because Heimrat Becker, like he found it at a time on the concentration camps of Gusen, Mauthausen where no one really cared about it. Like these objects were just met with indifference, and then he brought them to a little shack to store them. Then they transferred into the Mumok, so then they got another statues in the Mumok, and then in the performance a different kind of statue. I'm always saying this word wrong. Statues.
Thank you.
I don't. Yeah, I think it's a very complex relationship, maybe, and it's wandering. I don't know between.
I think we should wrap up, but I think just also the connection between the canon of both the fine arts or performance art and what is considered to be real art and what is allowed to really represent something, no, with the question that was spoken before, and I think it's also very connected to the canon of history of what crosses the canon of history to be remembered or to be forgotten, and to jeopardize that. And I think that would be a good way to continue. Thank you very much for being here. We have today a special prize for 15 euros. We're very happy if you buy one. And thank you very much to everyone here, to Depo for sure. And yeah. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Zwei kriege ich? Ja.